create abstract 3D shapes, stunning star flares, and more. This Photoshop tutorial will show you how to create a high-res poster using only the tools in Photoshop. To follow this tutorial, you'll need Photoshop CS5 extended. Start by creating a new tabloid-sized document. Go to File, New, select the US Paper preset, then choose Tabloid. We're going to start by creating the background. In the Layers palette, click on this button here, then choose Gradient Fill. Adjust the gradient settings like this. Reduce the opacity of this layer to 75%. Then create a new gradient adjustment layer. Adjust the settings like this. Next, we're going to add the image of the girl. To place this image, go to File, Place. Browse for the image, then click OK. Scale the image to your likings. If you hold the Shift key while dragging, it'll constrain the proportions so that you don't stretch your image. Press Enter on your keyboard to apply the transformation. Create a selection of the girl. There are many ways to create a selection, and the best technique depends on the photo you're using. For our photo, the background is very simple, so we're just going to use the Magic Wand tool. Start by creating a selection of the background. Next, choose Select, Inverse to inverse the selection. You should now have a selection of just the dancer. Click on the Refine Edge button to enhance the selection. You can find this button in the option bar when you have any selection tool selected. If you look in the hair, you'll notice that the selection doesn't look very good. First, change the View mode to Overlay. Click on the Refine Radius tool button, then paint over the hair. Note that the Refine Radius tool is only available in Photoshop CS5 or newer. You can adjust your brush size by pressing the square bracket keys on your keyboard. This is what your selection should look like after you've painted over the hair. Click OK to apply the adjustments. In the Layers palette, click on the Add Layer Mask button. This will create a layer mask using the selection you just created. Now we're going to create the diagonal bar brush. Create a new layer by clicking on the Create a New Layer button in the Layers palette. Make sure this layer is positioned as the top layer so we can see what we're doing. Select the rectangular marquee tool, then create a selection similar to this. Fill the selected area with black. You can do this by going to Edit, Fill. Set the contents to black, then click OK. Now go to Edit, Transform, Skew. Drag the top middle input slider to the right so that it is skewed like this. Go to Edit, Transform, Rotate. Move your cursor outside the bounding box, then drag to rotate. If you hold the Shift key while rotating, it'll snap the rotation to 15-degree increments. Rotate it to something like this. We're now going to create a brush using this shape. Go to Edit, Define Brush. You can name it anything you like. I'm going to name it Diagonal Bar. Click OK, then deactivate the current selection by pressing Ctrl-D or Command-D on a Mac. We're done with this layer, so go ahead and delete it. Create a new layer, then position it below the layer with the girl. Rename this layer to Diagonal Bars. You can rename layers by double-clicking on the layer name. Select the Brush tool, then right-click anywhere in the document window. Select the diagonal bar brush that we just created. Go to Window, Brushes to bring up the Brushes palette. Checkmark the Shape Dynamics option, then set the Size Jitter to 100%. Now checkmark the Scattering option, then set the Scatter to 100%. Make sure your foreground color is black, then begin painting like this. Now we're going to add a gradient to this layer. Right-click on the layer, then choose Blending Options. Select the gradient overlay style, then choose this gradient. Set the angle to -45 degrees and scale to 150%. You can drag the gradient to reposition it to something like this. Now we're going to create a 3D version of the diagonal bars. This is where you need the extended version of Photoshop CS5. Create a new layer, then position it as the top layer. Rename this layer to 3D Diagonal Bars. Set your foreground color to white. Use the brush tool to paint some diagonal bars by clicking. Don't make it too big, or else it may be too complicated for Photoshop to process. If it's too complicated, Photoshop won't let you convert to a 3D layer. Hold down the Control or Command key on a Mac, then click on the thumbnail of the 3D Diagonal Bars layer. This will create a selection of the layer. You can create a 3D object using the selection, but the edges will be jagged. To get the sharpest edges, we'll create a vector path. In the Paths palette, Window Paths, click on the Make Work Path from Selection button. This will create a vector path using the selection. Go to 3D, Repoussé, Selected Path. You'll need Photoshop Extended, not the regular version, to get access to this menu. The 3D Object Rotate tool should already be selected. Drag the 3D object to rotate like this. Set the lights to CAD Optimized, then adjust the depth to reduce the thickness. Here's what the diagonal bars look like. Go to Layer, Layer Style, Gradient Overlay. Set the blend mode to Overlay, Gradient to Spectrum, and Scale to 150%. Don't click OK yet. Adjust the angle setting so that your gradient is aligned with the direction of the diagonal bars, like this. Click and drag directly on the image to reposition the gradient so that your gradient goes from blue to pink. Click on the Color Overlay option to enable it. Set the blend mode to Overlay and color to pink. F, F7, F7, F to be precise. Click OK to apply the changes. Now we're going to rasterize the 3D object to speed up Photoshop's performance for the edits we'll be doing next. Before we rasterize the layer, set the render quality to Ray Traced Final. You can do this by going to Window, 3D to bring up the 3D palette, then changing the quality to Ray Traced Final. This will improve the edges of the 3D. You'll see a blue grid scanning across the image. This is Photoshop rendering the 3D scene and may take a few minutes or more before it starts to look good. You can stop it when the quality looks good enough. If you click or do anything inside Photoshop while it is rendering, the rendering will pause. To resume it, just go to 3D, Resume Progressive Render. After rendering, your 3D object should have sharp lines and smooth shading like this. Right-click on the layer, then choose Rasterize 3D. Position the layer below the girl. Press Ctrl-G or Command-G on a Mac. This will put the current layer into a group. While holding down the Alt or Option key on a Mac, drag the diagonal bars like this. Because you're holding down the Alt or Option key, Photoshop is duplicating the layer every time you drag. If you look in your Layers palette, you can see that you have a bunch of new layers inside the group you just made. Rename this group to 3D Diagonal Bars. Make sure you have the 3D Diagonal Bars group selected. Select the Move tool, then position the 3D Diagonal Bars to anywhere you like. Here's where I placed mine. Next, we're going to adjust the brightness and contrast of the 3D diagonal lines. As you might have guessed, we can do this with the Brightness Contrast tool. In older versions of Photoshop, you would have to apply it to each layer one at a time, or merge the layers. With the latest version of Photoshop, you can just bundle up all the layers by converting it into a smart object. This way, we can use the layer as a clipping mask for the Brightness Contrast Adjustment layer. You'll see how this works in a second. Make sure you have the 3D Diagonal Bars group selected, then go to Layer, Smart Objects, Convert to Smart Object. Now go to Layer, New Adjustment Layer, Brightness Contrast. A new layer window will appear. If you don't see this, make sure that you are doing this from the menus and not from the Layers or Adjustments palette. Checkmark the Use Previous Layer to Create Clipping Mask option, then click OK. You should now have a Brightness Contrast Adjustment layer above your 3D Diagonal Bars layer. Notice how the adjustment layer has an arrow pointing to the layer below? This means that it is only affecting the layer below. It does this by using that layer's transparency as a layer mask. In the brightness contrast settings, checkmark the Use Legacy option, then set the brightness and contrast to 50. If you don't see this, go to Window, Adjustments. Change the blending mode of this layer to luminosity. This blending mode prevents the brightness contrast layer from altering the colors. Here's what the image looks like so far. Now we're going to create the interlaced circles. Before we can do this, we'll need to create an interlaced pattern. Start by creating a new 100 by 100 pixels document. Select the rectangular marquee tool, then, in the options bar, set the style to fixed size, width to 100%, and height to 25px. Click to create a selection like this. Create a new layer, then fill the selected area with black. You can do this by going to Edit, Fill, setting the contents to black, then clicking OK. Press Ctrl or Command-J to duplicate the layer. Go to Filter, Other, Offset. This is a filter very few people use, and it's great for moving objects precisely. We're going to move it by 50 pixels down, so set the vertical setting to +50, then click OK. Now we're going to rotate the image 45 using the Crop tool. Before we do this, go to the View menu and make sure that you have the Snap and Snap to Document Bounds option selected. Select the Crop tool, then create a crop area of the entire image. Rotate it by 45 degrees. As you drag, hold down the Shift key so that Photoshop rotates it in 15-degree increments. Drag the outer 4 handles towards the center. It should snap to the document edge. Go to Edit, Define Pattern. Set the name to Diagonal Interlace, then click OK. Now that we're done creating this pattern, close this file without saving and switch back to the original project. First, make sure you have the top layer selected. Now select the Ellipse tool, and in the Options bar, click on the Shape Layers button and set the style to Default Style, None. Click on the drop-down arrow to bring up the ellipse options, then select Circle. Start by drawing a circle somewhere where you want to add an interlaced circle. If you look in the Layers palette, you'll see that Photoshop created a new solid color layer as the top layer. Right-click on the layer, then choose Blending Options. Set the fill opacity to 0%. Select the Pattern Overlay layer style, then set the blend mode to Screen and Pattern to the diagonal interlace pattern we just created. Adjust the scale so that you get something like this. Click OK to apply the changes. Rename this layer to Interlaced Circles. Now select the Ellipse tool, then click on the Add to Shape Area button. This will let you add more circles to the vector mask. Draw a few more circles. If you make a mistake, just press Ctrl or Command-Z to undo, then try again. Create a few circles, but not so many because we'll be adding more in a bit. Duplicate the Interlaced Circles layer by pressing Ctrl or Command-J, then move this layer below the layer of the girl. Add more circles just like what you did earlier. Make sure you have the vector mask of this layer selected, then use the Ellipse tool to add more circles. Reduce the opacity of the 2 interlaced circles layer slightly to give them some transparency. Now we're going to add some star filters to enhance the background. Create a new layer, then name this layer Star Filter. Position this layer above the 2 gradient fill layers. Change the blending mode to Screen, then fill this layer with black by going to Edit, Fill. Set the contents to black, then click OK. Select the Brush tool, then pick this hard round brush here. Adjust the brush size so that you get a brush about this size. You can change the brush size by pressing the left or right bracket keys on your keyboard. Go to Window, Brushes to bring up the brush palette. Enable the Shape Dynamics option, then set the size jitter to 100%. Next, enable the scattering option, then set the scatter to 1000%. Set your foreground color to whites, then paint in the areas where you want the star filter effect to appear. Duplicate the layer by pressing Ctrl or Command-J, then go to Filter, Blur, Motion Blur. Set the angle to 45 degrees, then zoom out of the preview area so that you can see what you're doing. Adjust the settings so that you get a motion blur like this, then click OK. Repeat this filter by pressing Ctrl or Command-F. If this doesn't work, you can also do this by going to Filter, Motion Blur. Select the other star filter layer, then go to Filter, Blur, Motion Blur. Set the angle to -45 degrees, then click OK. Repeat this filter by pressing Ctrl or Command F. Select one of the star filter layers, then hold down the Ctrl or Command key to select the other. Merge the layers by going to Layer, Merge Layers. Change the blend mode to Screen, then rename this layer back to Star Filter. We're going to sharpen it a bit. To do this, go to Filter, Sharpen, Unsharp Mask. Set the amount to 200%, then adjust the radius so that your star filter effect looks like this. Here's what the image looks like so far. Now we're going to add a circular wave graphic. Start by creating a new Photoshop document with a width and height of 10,000 pixels. Select the rectangular marquee tool, then set the style to fixed size, width to 100%, and height to 500 pixels. Create a selection like this. It should snap to the top edge. If it's not, go to View, Snap, and View Snap to, then enable Documents Bounds. Create a new layer, then fill it with black. Go to Edit, Free Transform. Click on this button here, then set the Y-axis to 1000 pixels. Press Enter on your keyboard to apply the changes. Go to Edit, Step Backwards to undo the move. Now press Ctrl, Alt, Shift, and T. If you're on a Mac, you would hold down the Command, Option, Shift, and T. Press this 9 times and it'll duplicate the bars like this. Press Ctrl or Command D to deselect the selection. Go to Filter, Distort, Polar Coordinates. Set the mode to Rectangular to Polar, then click OK. Go to Select All to make a selection of the entire document. Then press Ctrl or Command C to copy. Switch back to the other document, then press Ctrl or Command V to paste. You can close the other Photoshop document without saving. Zoom out, then go to Edit, Transform, Skew. Drag the top right handle towards the left, like this. Next, go to Edit, Transform, Scale. Drag the bottom right handle to the bottom right corner of the Photoshop document. Rotate, position, and scale the circle like this. Move this layer below the girl, then change the opacity to 50%. Go to Layer, Layer Style, Gradient Overlay. Set the gradient to Spectrum, Angle to 90 degrees, and Scale to 150%. Next, reposition the gradient to something like this. Add a layer mask to the current layer by going to Layer, Layer Mask, Reveal All. Select the Gradient tool, then in the option bar, set the settings like shown. Create a gradient from the top to bottom like this. Rename the layer to Radial Circle. We're almost done. To finish this poster, we're going to add a star flare to each side of the headphone. Start by creating a new layer and positioning it as the top layer. Name this layer Star Flare. Fill this layer with black. Go to Filter, Render, Lens Flare. Set the brightness to 100% and choose Movie Prime as the lens type. Position the lens flare in the middle like this. Click OK. Next, go to Filter, Blur, Gaussian Blur. Adjust the radius so that the blue line disappears. Now go to Edit, Free Transform. Set the height to 10%, then press Enter to apply the changes. Here's what the lens flare looks like. Go to Edit, Free Transform again, then set the angle to 30 degrees. Your lens flare will rotate like this. Press Enter to apply the transformation. Change the blending mode of this layer to Screen. Now press Ctrl, Alt, Shift, and T, or Command, Option, Shift, and T on a Mac 5 times. Here's what the star flare looks like. In the Layers palette, you'll notice that Photoshop created a bunch of layers, one for each of the star flare. Hold the Control or Command button, then select all of the star flare layers. Go to Layer, Merge Layers, then change the blending mode back to Screen. Here's what the lens flare looks like. Select the Move tool, then move the lens flare over the right side of the headphone. Go to Edit, Transform, Skew. Drag the bottom right handle towards the center like this. Next, go to Image, Adjustments, Hue Saturation. Checkmark the Colorize option, then set the hue to 200 and saturation to 100. Duplicate the star flare layer by pressing Ctrl or Command-J, then move the star flare to the other ear like this. Next, go to Image, Adjustments, Hue Saturation. Set the hue to 180, then click OK. Add a layer mask to the current layer. Select the Eraser tool, then right-click anywhere in the document window to bring up the brush settings. Make sure your background color is black. You can simply press D on your keyboard to reset your foreground and background colors. Erase over the headphone like this. Here's what the image looks like with the star flare. To complete the image, we're going to add a photo effect to the girl. Select the layer with the girl, then go to Layer, New Adjustment Layer, Black and White. Checkmark the Use Previous Layer to create clipping mask option, set the blending mode to Overlay, and then click OK. If you don't see this window, make sure you added the adjustment layer through the menu and not from the Layers or Adjustments palettes. Next, go to Layer, New Adjustment Layer, Brightness Contrast. Use Previous Layer to create clipping mask option, then click OK. Set the brightness to 25 and contrast to -50. We're done! Here's the final result of this music poster Photoshop tutorial. Play around with the settings and try to make one on your own. Here's another example of what can be done by varying this Photoshop tutorial a bit. Subscribe to us for more great Photoshop tutorials.